Welcome, friends, and settle in, because tonight we walk among the graves of the unexplained. These are the resting places of celebrities who died under mysterious circumstances, men and women whose final hours remain, even now, a riddle that no coroner, no detective, and no passage of time has ever fully solved. For most of the departed, the story of how they left this world is a settled thing, written plainly on a certificate and closed. But for the souls we visit tonight, that final chapter was left open, its last page smudged or torn away entirely, so that the living have argued over it for years and sometimes for a whole century. Some of them were found in circumstances that made no sense at all. In a locked car full of gasoline, at the bottom of a swimming pool, slumped against a bedroom wall, or floating in the cold and silent sea. Some were the victims of crimes so baffling that the killer simply walked away into history, leaving behind only questions and a grieving family. Some died in ways the authorities called an accident, or a suicide, or misadventure, while those who knew them best shook their heads and quietly insisted that the official story could not possibly be true. And one of them, as we shall see at the very end of our journey, vanished so completely that there is no grave to stand before at all, only an empty stone and the eternal question of where he went. We will travel far tonight, from the marble mausoleums of old Hollywood to a quiet churchyard in the hills of Pennsylvania, from a heritage-listed grave in Australia to a cenotaph in the fields of Arlington, and everywhere we go we will find the same unsettling thing: a famous name, a sudden ending, and a silence where the truth ought to be. Let me be clear about how we will walk this uncertain ground. We are not here to accuse the innocent, nor to declare wild theories to be proven fact. We will tell you plainly what the official record says, and just as plainly where that record has been doubted, and where the whispers and the evidence pull against each other, we will set them side by side and let you decide for yourself what to believe. It is worth pausing, before we set out together, to notice just how many different shapes a mystery can take. Some of the deaths we will visit tonight were plainly and brutally violent, murders whose only real riddle is the name of the killer, a name that the law somehow never managed to supply. Others wore the quiet mask of an accident, or an illness, or a private despair, an official verdict that seemed to close the matter for good, until you looked a little closer and found that the details would not line up, that the timeline would not hold, that the story the authorities told simply could not be squared with the person they were telling it about. And a few are mysteries of a stranger kind still, deaths so tangled in coincidence, or in the secret workings of powerful people, that we may never truly know whether we are looking at plain misfortune, or at murder wearing the mask of misfortune. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and step carefully as we go. For the ground here is uncertain and the questions are old and deep, and let us begin at the very dawn of Hollywood itself, with one of the first great scandals the movie colony ever knew. Let us begin at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in New York, before a small stone mausoleum bearing the name Pickford, where one of the silent screen's very first sweethearts has rested for more than 100 years beneath a cloud of unanswered questions. Olive Thomas was a stunning young beauty, a celebrated artist's model, and Ziegfeld girl who became one of the first true movie stars, the very picture of the carefree flapper she helped to invent on screen. In the late summer of 1920, she and her husband, Jack Pickford, the younger brother of the legendary Mary Pickford, traveled to Paris for a second honeymoon, hoping to repair a marriage that had begun to fray. It was there, in the early hours of the morning, after a long night out on the town, that tragedy struck. Olive, reaching in the dark of their hotel room, swallowed a large dose of mercury bichloride, a highly poisonous solution that had been prescribed to her husband as a topical medicine and was never meant to be taken by mouth. She died in agony 5 days later, at just 25 years old, with her husband at her side. The French authorities, after some investigation, ruled it a tragic accident, and that is very likely the truth of it. But the newspapers of the day, in what was one of the first great celebrity death frenzies, would not let it rest, spinning wild tales of suicide, of scandal, and even of murder, forever tinting her memory with suspicion. The poisonous solution she drank in the dark had been prescribed to treat her husband's chronic and shameful illness, and she seems simply to have mistaken it for a sleeping draught or for a glass of water. In her final agonized days, half-blinded and barely able to speak, She struggled to explain to the baffled French police what had happened to her, and they left her bedside satisfied that it had been nothing but a ghastly accident. Her body was brought home to New York and laid here at Woodlawn. And to this very day, some say her restless spirit lingers in the old New Amsterdam theater where she once performed. She rests here now, the beautiful girl whose sudden and strange death set the pattern for so many Hollywood mysteries still to come. Let us travel now across the country to Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles, to the grave of a man who gave the world one of its most beloved comedy acts, yet whose own death may have been a murder that Hollywood itself conspired to bury. Ted Healy was a hugely popular vaudeville star and the creator of the Three Stooges, the man who first assembled that troupe of slapstick clowns before they went on to their own immortal fame. In December of 1937, Healy was out celebrating two joyful occasions at once: the birth of his first child and the success of his latest film, at the Trocadero, a fashionable nightclub on the Sunset Strip. There, by every account, he became embroiled in a drunken altercation, and he went home that night badly beaten with a deep gash over his eye. Within hours, he had slipped into unconsciousness, and soon after he was dead, at just 41 years old. The official ruling from the county coroner was that Healy had died of kidney failure brought on by his heavy drinking, a quiet and unremarkable end. But the whispers began at once and have never stopped. For one persistent account holds that he was set upon and fatally beaten by three men, said by some to have included a burly character actor and a future producer of the James Bond films, and that a powerful studio, fearing scandal, quietly made the whole affair disappear. Healy was a giant of vaudeville and early sound film, a generous mentor whose protégés included Milton Berle, Bob Hope, and Red Skelton, but he was also a hard-drinking man who left behind a long trail of feuds, lawsuits, and enemies. The names attached to the alleged beating are startling ones, said by one prominent account to include a burly Oscar-winning character actor, a young man who would go on to produce the James Bond films, and a mob-connected figure who had once been married to another doomed starlet whose own death remains disputed. So broke was Healy at the very end, despite a career of nearly 40 films, that studio employees had to take up a collection just to pay for his funeral. Whether he died of drink or of a beating covered up by the most powerful people in town, no one was ever charged, and the truth was laid to rest here at Calvary, along with the man who made a nation laugh. Now we come to one of the darkest and most enduring mysteries in all of American history, and we approach it softly and with respect, for it involves the murder of a young woman whose killer was never found. In Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, on a gentle green slope, lies Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress who came to be known to the world by a haunting nickname, the Black Dahlia. In January of 1947, her life was ended in a crime of such shocking brutality that it seized the attention of the entire nation and has never let it go. We will spare her the indignity of dwelling on the terrible details, for she deserves to be remembered as a person and not as a spectacle. What matters for our journey is this: that despite one of the largest investigations in the history of Los Angeles, despite more than 50 people confessing falsely to the crime, and despite countless suspects, theories, and books written across nearly 80 years, the identity of her killer has never been established. The case remains open to this day, the most famous unsolved murder in the city's history. In the weeks after the crime, a person claiming to be the killer taunted the newspapers with anonymous letters and telephone calls, even mailing in some of the young woman's own belongings, and yet still the police could not close their hands around a single suspect. Elizabeth Short had come to California from Massachusetts with the same dream that had drawn so many others, of one day seeing her name up in lights, and instead her name became attached to one of the grimmest legends in the history of American crime, picked over endlessly in books and films and documentaries. Dozens of men and women falsely confessed to the killing, muddying the waters beyond repair, and a long parade of suspects has been proposed across the decades, from surgeons to drifters, without a shred of conclusive proof against any one of them. Her grieving mother brought her broken body north to Oakland to be buried far from the scene of the horror, and she lies here now in quiet dignity, a young woman whose name became a legend for the worst of reasons, and whose murderer took his secret to his own grave. Let us turn now to Forest Lawn in Glendale, to the resting place of one of the most magnificent voices in the history of popular music, a man whose sudden and violent death is disputed to this day. Sam Cooke was the silky-voiced king of soul, the singer and songwriter behind timeless songs of joy and longing, a pioneering black artist and businessman at the very height of his powers. And then, on a December night in 1964, at just 33 years old, he was shot dead at a modest Los Angeles motel by the establishment's manager, who claimed she had fired in self-defense during a violent confrontation. An inquest swiftly ruled the killing a justifiable homicide, and the case was closed. But for many who loved him, and for his family above all, that tidy official account has never sat right. The circumstances of that night were strange and murky, filled with gaps and contradictions, and questions have lingered ever since about what truly happened in and around that motel room, about whether robbery or something darker was involved, and about whether a beloved and powerful black man was denied a real investigation in the America of his day. No further charges were ever brought, and the full truth of Sam Cooke's last night went with him into the ground. He had given the world You Send Me and Cupid and Wonderful World, and he had only just recorded his towering civil rights anthem, A Change Is Gonna Come, a song that would outlive him and become a hymn of hope for a nation. He was also a shrewd and pioneering businessman, a rarity for a black artist of his time, owning both his own record label and his own publishing. The events of that final night were confused and bitterly contested from the very start, involving a young woman he had left a club with, a frantic and half-dressed confrontation, and a manager who fired the fatal shots and was never charged. And to his family and his millions of admirers, the whole official account has always felt like a story built to close a case, rather than to find the truth. He rests here now at Forest Lawn, his glorious voice echoing still, the exact manner of his death, a wound that has never fully healed. Now let us journey east to Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, to a simple grave that may hold the answer to one of the great questions of the 20th century. Dorothy Kilgallen was one of the most famous journalists in America, a fearless newspaper columnist, and a beloved panelist on the television program What's My Line? But in her final years, she had taken on the most dangerous story of her life, an independent investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. She had secured a private interview with Jack Ruby, the man who killed the accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, and she boasted to friends that she was about to break the case wide open, that she would have the biggest scoop of the century. Then, in November of 1965, she was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse, and the medical examiner ruled that she had died from a combination of alcohol and barbiturates, with the circumstances listed as undetermined. To this day, many are convinced that Dorothy Kilgallen was silenced, murdered to keep her from revealing what she had learned, and that her private files on the assassination, which vanished after her death, held secrets someone was desperate to protect. For 15 years, she had been a fixture in America's living rooms as a quick-witted panelist on the game show What's My Line, even as her syndicated column reached many millions, and she covered the great trials of her age. But it was the Kennedy assassination that consumed her final years, and her exclusive interview with Jack Ruby, along with her publishing of his secret testimony months before it was officially released, made her a genuine thorn in the side of the established version of events. She was found dead only hours after taping her very last television broadcast. And crucially, the thick file of notes she had compiled on the case, the fruit of her long and dogged investigation, vanished from her home and was never recovered, a detail that has fueled dark suspicion ever since. Whether she was the victim of a tragic accident or of a chilling conspiracy, the reporter who knew too much rests here now, her final and greatest story left forever unfinished. Let us travel now back to California, to Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills, to the grave of a young rock and roll star whose death is one of the strangest ever recorded in the music world. Bobby Fuller had just tasted real fame in 1966 with his electrifying hit, I Fought the Law. And at only 23, a bright future seemed to stretch out before him. Then, one July night, after receiving a mysterious late phone call that drew him out of his home, he vanished for hours. He was found the next afternoon by his own mother, dead in a car parked outside his Hollywood apartment, the vehicle and his body doused in gasoline. The scene was baffling and disturbing in the extreme, and the response of the authorities only deepened the mystery, for the case was hastily ruled first a suicide and then an accident, and no real criminal investigation was ever launched. Almost no one who has studied the case believes those official conclusions. There were signs of a struggle. The timeline made little sense, and Fuller had every reason to live and none to die. Theories have swirled for decades that he was murdered, perhaps by figures connected to the mob-adjacent corners of the music business, and his family long hoped in vain to have the case reopened. A devoted disciple of his fellow Texan Buddy Holly, Fuller had clawed his way up from El Paso to the national charts, and I Fought the Law had made him a star with a bright open road ahead of him. The details of his death only compounded the horror, for although his car and his clothing were soaked through with gasoline, none at all was found in his stomach, and his body appeared to have lain undiscovered for many hours before the car simply reappeared, as if from nowhere. Outside his home, the Los Angeles police, in disarray after their own chief of detectives had died just days before, made little serious effort to investigate, and later theories, including one advanced by his own brother, would point toward the mob-connected corners of the record business that the young musician had unwittingly brushed up against. He rests here now at Forest Lawn, a rising star extinguished in an instant, the truth of that gasoline-soaked car never explained. Now let us travel far from Hollywood, to a quiet Ukrainian cemetery near the small town of Berwick, in the coal country of Pennsylvania, to the grave of an actor whose death remains an open question to this day. Nick Adams was a charismatic and ambitious performer, a close friend of James Dean and Elvis Presley, an Academy Award nominee who seemed poised for real stardom, but his career had stalled and his personal life had grown troubled. And in February of 1968, at just 36 years old, he was found dead in his Beverly Hills home, slumped and fully clothed against his bedroom wall. The autopsy revealed a powerful and dangerous combination of prescription sedatives in his body, enough to cause sudden collapse. Yet the coroner, the famed doctor, Thomas Noguchi, was unable to say with any certainty how those drugs had come to be there. And he issued one of the most haunting rulings imaginable, certifying the death as accidental, suicidal, and undetermined all at once. There were no needle marks, no clear suicide note, and some who knew Adams suspected that he had been murdered, though no motive or evidence was ever established. He became one more entry in the eerie list of tragedies to strike the young cast of Rebel Without a Cause. Adams had earned an Academy Award nomination and had been close enough to both James Dean and Elvis Presley to lend his story an extra layer of Hollywood intrigue, but by the end his once promising career had collapsed and his finances lay in ruins. The powerful sedative found in his body was in fact a medicine prescribed to ease the torments of alcohol withdrawal, and combining it with the other drugs present was, physicians would later warn, extraordinarily dangerous. Some who knew him simply could not accept that this ambitious, forward-looking man had chosen to give up, and they wondered aloud whether another hand had been involved, though no evidence of foul play was ever found. His passing joined an uncanny roll call of early tragedy among the young cast of Rebel Without a Cause, a film that seemed almost to carry a curse. He rests here now in his home soil, beneath a stone bearing the image of the cowboy hero he once played, the manner of his death forever uncertain. Let us cross the ocean now to England, to Cheltenham Cemetery, to the grave of a founding member of the greatest rock and roll band in the world, whose death by water has never been fully explained. Brian Jones was the brilliant, troubled multi-instrumentalist who founded the Rolling Stones, only to be pushed aside by his own bandmates as his drug use spiraled and then dismissed from the group entirely in the summer of 1969. Just weeks later, in the small hours of a July night, he was discovered motionless at the bottom of the swimming pool at his country home, a fine old farmhouse that had once belonged to the author of Winnie the Pooh. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by misadventure, an accidental drowning brought on by drink and drugs. But that verdict has been challenged almost from the moment it was handed down, for a builder who had been working at the house, and who was among the last to see Jones alive, was said years later to have confessed on his deathbed to killing him. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts, the timeline did not add up, and to this day his own daughter and legions of fans believe that Brian Jones was murdered that night. 2 days after he died, the Rolling Stones played a massive free concert in his memory. It was Jones who had named the Rolling Stones and shaped their early, blues-soaked sound, only to be steadily eclipsed by Jagger and Richards, and finally cast out of his own band just 3 weeks before he died. The doubts about that night are many and stubborn, for Jones was known as a strong swimmer. The amount of alcohol in his body was relatively modest, and the builder who had been renovating the house, and who was among the last to see him alive, became the focus of decades of suspicion. after a second-hand account emerged of a whispered deathbed confession. The Sussex police have quietly reviewed the case more than once over the years, and each time have found no reason to overturn the original verdict. Yet the rumors of murder have never once fallen silent. He rests here now in his hometown, another of the tragic figures lost at the fateful age of 27. The truth of that dark swimming pool never brought to light. Now let us return to New York, to that same Gate of Heaven cemetery in Hawthorne, to the grave of an actor whose murder baffled investigators for years. Sal Mineo had been a teenage sensation in the 1950s, earning 2 Academy Award nominations, most famously for playing the sensitive young Plato alongside James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. By 1976, his career was beginning a promising revival when, one February night, he was attacked and stabbed in the alley behind his West Hollywood apartment as he returned home from a play rehearsal. He collapsed and died at the scene, at just 37 years old. At first, the crime seemed utterly senseless and impossible to solve, for his wallet had not been taken, leading many to whisper that the killing was personal, perhaps connected to his private life, and the description of the fleeing suspect seemed to match no one. For over 2 years, the case remained a frightening Hollywood mystery. Only later did the truth emerge, almost by accident, when a small-time criminal named Lionel Ray Williams was overheard boasting of the killing, revealing that Mineo had simply been the random victim of a robbery that went wrong. Mineo had been one of the most promising young actors of his whole generation, twice nominated for an Oscar and even briefly a chart-topping pop singer, and at the time of his death he was earning strong notices in a daring stage play, his career quietly on the rise once more. The investigation was long confounded by the fact that eyewitnesses described the fleeing attacker as a white man with straight blonde hair, a description that matched not at all the man eventually convicted, and it was only when that man's own wife came forward, and when he was overheard boasting of the crime behind bars, that the scattered pieces finally fell into place, revealing a senseless street robbery rather than the sinister, targeted killing that so many had imagined. He rests here now, in New York, the mystery of his death eventually solved, but only after years of fear and speculation had run their course. Let us travel now to Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, a tiny cemetery hidden among the city's towers, to the grave of a television star whose brutal murder has never been solved. Bob Crane was a household name in the 1960s as the wisecracking hero of the hit sitcom Hogan's Heroes. But after the show ended, his career faded, and he spent his later years touring in dinner theater productions. It was while performing in one such play, in June of 1978, that he was found bludgeoned to death in his Scottsdale, Arizona apartment, at the age of 49. The killing was savage and the investigation troubled from the start. Suspicion fell heavily on a close friend of Crane's, but the physical evidence was thin and poorly handled. And although that man was finally arrested and put on trial many years later, he was acquitted. The murder weapon was never found, and the case officially remains unsolved to this day, one of Hollywood's most enduring cold cases. Crane's body was first laid to rest elsewhere, and later moved here to Westwood, where he lies among many other famous names. At his peak, Crane's grinning face was known in nearly every household in America. But the man led a hidden and reckless private life, and by the time of his death, he had been reduced to touring the small dinner theater circuit. His body was discovered by a co-star who had come to his apartment when he failed to answer his door. Suspicion settled for 2 full decades upon a close friend and companion. But the crime scene work back in 1978 had been badly bungled, and when that man was at last brought to trial in the 1990s, the physical evidence proved too thin, and he walked free. His strange life and death were later dramatized in a feature film, but the case itself has never been officially closed, and the list of those said to have wished him harm remains a long one. He rests here now, the genial star of a beloved comedy, the question of who killed him and why, still hanging unanswered in the desert air. Now, let us cross the sea again to Paris, to the Montparnasse Cemetery, to the grave of an American actress whose tragic death was tangled up with the secret machinery of her own government. Jean Seberg was a luminous star, discovered as a teenager and made famous in the French New Wave classic Breathless. But she was also a passionate supporter of civil rights causes, and for that, she became a target of the FBI's notorious secret program of surveillance and harassment known as COINTELPRO. The Bureau planted a cruel and false story in the press about her pregnancy, a smear so devastating that, by her husband's account, It triggered a breakdown, the premature birth of her child, and that baby's death days later. Seberg never recovered, and in the summer of 1979 she was found dead in the back of her car in Paris, with a bottle of barbiturates and a note. The police ruled it a probable suicide. Yet the circumstances were deeply strange, for the level of alcohol in her body was so high that investigators doubted she could have driven the car there herself. Personal items were missing, and the case was murky enough that Paris authorities filed charges against persons unknown. Whether she took her own life in despair or was helped into that final darkness by unseen hands, her death remains a subject of genuine mystery. Plucked from among thousands of hopefuls to play Joan of Arc while still a teenager, Seberg went on to become an icon of the French New Wave and a fearless supporter of the American civil rights movement, and it was precisely that activism that marked her out as a target. When she became pregnant, the Bureau planted a false and vicious story in the press about the identity of the father, a lie designed to humiliate her, and the shock of it, she and her husband always maintained, triggered the premature birth and swift death of her baby, leaving her prey to a recurring despair on each anniversary of that loss. Just days after her body was found, the FBI was forced to admit, under Freedom of Information laws, that it had deliberately set out to defame her, a chilling confirmation of how the machinery of the state had helped to break her. She rests here now in Paris, a gifted woman hounded to her grave. Let us travel now to the far side of the world, to Fremantle Cemetery in Western Australia, to a grave so beloved that it has been granted official heritage protection. Bon Scott was the electrifying frontman of the hard rock band AC/DC, the charismatic and hard-living singer whose voice powered the band to the brink of global superstardom. In February of 1980, at just 33 years old, he spent a long night drinking in London, and afterward was left to sleep it off in a friend's car. He was found dead there the next day, and the coroner ruled the cause to be acute alcohol poisoning, a death by misadventure. For most, that is the end of the story, a tragic and cautionary tale of excess. But the circumstances have never entirely satisfied everyone, for the friend who was with him that night later vanished from public view, and rumors have swirled for decades of other substances, of altered timelines, and of a cover-up, none ever proven. What is certain is that his death nearly ended the band, before they regrouped and dedicated their monumental next album to his memory. Ranked by One magazine as the single greatest frontman in the entire history of rock, Scott had just helped drive AC/DC to the very brink of global superstardom with the album Highway to Hell when he died. The friend who had taken him home that freezing London night and left him to sleep it off in the car later gave shifting accounts of events and eventually vanished from public life altogether, a disappearance that has only fed the enduring theories of heroin, of a botched cover-up, or of some darker truth than a simple night of drink. His stunned bandmates nearly gave up for good, then rallied instead to record Back in Black, one of the best-selling albums ever made, its stark all-black cover, a mourning shroud for the singer they had lost. He rests here now in the town where he grew up, his grave a place of pilgrimage for hundreds of thousands of fans. The exact details of his final night, still quietly debated. Now let us return to California and to the ocean itself, for our next resting place is not a plot of earth at all, but the wide blue Pacific. Dennis Wilson was the drummer of the Beach Boys, and the only true surfer among them, the wild, handsome heart of the band that had sung the ocean into legend. But his later years were consumed by addiction and hardship, and by the winter of 1983 he was a troubled man, living a chaotic and nomadic life. On the 28th of December, at a marina in Marina del Rey, he spent the day drinking heavily, and then dove again and again into the cold winter water, searching the bottom near an old boat slip for items he had thrown overboard years before. On one of those dives he did not come back up, and he drowned, at just 39 years old. His death was ruled a straightforward accident, and perhaps that is all it was. Yet, something about it feels hauntingly unresolved. A man drawn down to his death by the very sea he had made famous, diving alone into the dark for the ghosts of his own past. He had been the beating heart of the Beach Boys, and the only one among them who truly surfed, though his life had taken some very dark turns, including a notorious brush years earlier with Charles Manson. In his final days he had checked himself into detox facilities, only to walk straight back out of them again, and by that cold December afternoon at the marina, his blood held more than 3 times the amount of alcohol the law allowed for driving. Those aboard the boat reportedly assumed at first that he was only clowning around, as he so loved to do, and by the time they understood that something had gone terribly wrong, the man who had lived his whole life in the water had slipped away beneath it. It would take the personal intervention of the President of the United States to grant his family the rare permission to lay him to rest in the sea itself. Because he loved the water so, and with the help of a special dispensation, his family was granted the rare honor of burying him at sea, and his body was committed to the Pacific off the California coast. He rests there now, beneath the waves, a grave without a stone. Let us travel now to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, a peaceful resting place for many stars, to honor a young woman whose death was as preventable as it was mysterious in its timing. Aaliyah was one of the brightest talents of her generation, a gifted singer and actress who, at just 22, seemed destined for a long and dazzling career. In August of 2001, she and her team had just finished filming a music video in the Bahamas and were eager to fly home. They boarded a small chartered plane for the short hop back to Florida, and moments after takeoff, the aircraft crashed, killing everyone aboard. The investigation that followed uncovered a chain of disturbing facts: that the small plane had been dangerously overloaded with people and equipment, and that the pilot was not properly licensed to fly it and had traces of cocaine and alcohol in his body. It was, in the end, a catastrophe that never should have happened, a tragedy born of negligence and haste. And there was a chilling irony to it as well, for the video she had just completed was for a song called Rock the Boat. With hits like Try Again and Are You That Somebody, and a breakout role in the film Romeo Must Die, Aaliyah stood upon the very threshold of superstardom in both music and movies. The small chartered plane that afternoon was found to have been loaded some 700 pounds beyond its safe weight, carrying one passenger more than it was ever certified to hold, and its pilot, it later emerged, had falsified the records of his flying experience and had traces of cocaine and alcohol in his system. Witnesses would recall that the group, exhausted and desperate to get home, had pressed to take off at once despite plain concerns about the load, a fateful haste that doomed all 9 souls aboard the aircraft. Her family's wrongful death lawsuit against the charter operator was eventually settled, but no settlement could ever restore what that entirely preventable crash had stolen from the world. She rests here now at Ferncliff, a beloved star taken far too soon, the maddening question of how so many warning signs were ignored still lingering over her loss. Let us remain here at Ferncliff and walk to the grave of another music legend whose killing went unsolved for an entire generation. Jason Mizell was known to the world as Jam Master Jay, the brilliant DJ of Run DMC, the group that did more than almost any other to carry hip-hop into the mainstream. On an October evening in 2002, he was in his own recording studio in the Queens neighborhood where he grew up, when 2 people entered and shot him dead, at just 37 years old. Despite the fact that there were witnesses in the room, the case went cold and stayed cold for an astonishing 20 years, becoming one of the most painful unsolved mysteries in the history of American music, spoken of in the same breath as the killings of Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. For 2 decades, his family waited for answers that never came. Only many years later did federal prosecutors finally bring charges and secure convictions, alleging that the beloved DJ, a man famous for his anti-drug message, had been killed over a soured drug deal. Even then, the case continued to twist, with one conviction later thrown into doubt. As the DJ of Run DMC, Mizell had helped to tear down the wall between rap and rock, driving huge crossover hits like Walk This Way, and becoming one of the very first hip-hop artists ever embraced by mainstream radio and television. He championed his old neighborhood and mentored young talent, including a then-unknown rapper who would become the superstar 50 Cent, and he had lent his own name and face to a public campaign against drugs. That is what made the eventual prosecution's theory all the more painful, for authorities came at last to allege that this anti-drug icon had somehow been drawn into a soured cocaine deal that cost him his life. 2 men were finally convicted more than 20 years after the shooting, though even then, the case continued to twist and turn, with one of those hard-won convictions later thrown into fresh doubt by the courts. He rests here now, a pioneer of his art. The long silence around his death finally broken, but only after unimaginable patience and grief. Now let us return to Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills, to the grave of a beloved actor whose death, in a distant hotel room, remains strange and fiercely disputed. David Carradine was a screen icon, unforgettable as the wandering monk in the television series Kung Fu, and, to a new generation, as the title villain of Kill Bill. In June of 2009, at 72 years old, he was in Bangkok, Thailand, shooting a film when he was found dead in his hotel room. The circumstances were murky and unsettling from the very first reports. Thai police initially suspected suicide, but no note was found, and the coroner would eventually rule the death an accident of a private and unusual nature. His family, however, flatly rejected that conclusion. They did not believe he would have taken his own life. They were deeply troubled by the conflicting accounts coming out of Bangkok, and they went so far as to hire their own renowned pathologist and to ask the FBI to investigate, fearing that he had met with foul play, perhaps at the hands of some unknown group. No investigation ever produced a definitive answer, and so the death of David Carradine remains, officially and otherwise, a genuine mystery. For half a century, Carradine had been a fixture of American screens, unforgettable as the wandering monk Caine in Kung Fu, as the folk singer Woody Guthrie, and to a new generation as the deadly title figure of Quentin Tarantino's revenge saga. When he failed to appear for a meal with his film crew, he was found dead in his luxury hotel suite, and the confused and conflicting early reports out of Bangkok only multiplied the questions surrounding his end. His family hired the celebrated forensic pathologist Michael Baden to examine the evidence, publicly and forcefully rejected any notion that he had taken his own life, and pressed the American authorities to open an investigation of their own, citing deeply troubling accounts of the circumstances in which he had been discovered. No inquiry ever delivered them the certainty that they so desperately sought. He rests here now at Forest Lawn, the truth of his final hours in that faraway hotel still contested by those who loved him. Let us stay here in this same cemetery, for it holds another mystery from that very same year. Brittany Murphy was a vibrant and gifted young actress, beloved for her roles in films like Clueless and Girl, Interrupted, with a warmth and energy that lit up the screen. In December of 2009, at just 32 years old, she collapsed in her Hollywood Hills home and died. The coroner ruled that her death was caused by pneumonia, worsened by anemia and a combination of ordinary medications, a sad but seemingly natural end. And then, just 5 months later, the mystery deepened into something genuinely eerie. When her husband, Simon Monjack, died suddenly in the very same house, and his death too was attributed to pneumonia and anemia, an almost identical set of causes. The double tragedy set off a storm of speculation that has never fully died down. Her grieving father commissioned independent testing that he claimed revealed high levels of heavy metals in her body, raising the possibility of poisoning, while others pointed to toxic mold in the house. No case was ever proven, and officials stood by the original findings. But two nearly identical deaths in one home, months apart, remain a haunting and unsettled thing. A bubbly and luminous presence on screen, Murphy had charmed audiences in Clueless and 8 Mile, and lent her voice to Happy Feet and the long-running animated series King of the Hill. The weeks before her death had been strange and unlucky ones, including a doomed film shoot abroad from which she and her husband both returned ill, and it was her own mother who found her collapsed at home. Suspicion swirled around that husband, a man with a checkered past and mounting debts who died so soon after her, and in the very same house, of eerily similar causes. Her estranged father would go on to spend years fighting to have her remains independently tested, claiming the results pointed toward poisoning by heavy metals, even as the coroner's office stood firmly by its original and far more ordinary explanation. She rests here now at Forest Lawn, her bright light dimmed far too soon, the questions surrounding it never laid to rest. Now let us travel east once more, to Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, to the grave of one of the greatest singers who ever lived. Whitney Houston possessed a voice of such power and purity that it seemed to belong to another world, and for a time she was the biggest pop star on the planet. But her later years were shadowed by struggle, and in February of 2012, at just 48 years old, she was found unresponsive in a bathtub in her Beverly Hills hotel room, on the very eve of the Grammy Awards. The coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. It was a devastating and, on its face, a tragically explicable loss. And yet a terrible and mysterious echo would follow. For just 3 years later, her only daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, was found unresponsive in a bathtub in strikingly similar circumstances, and she too passed away. That uncanny repetition, mother and daughter meeting the same fate in the same terrible way, has left many unwilling to accept that either death was simply chance, and it lends Whitney's passing a lingering aura of something unresolved. Whitney Houston had sold more records than almost any other woman in history, and her soaring recording of "I Will Always Love You" remains one of the most beloved vocal performances ever captured on tape. She died on the very eve of music's biggest night, in a hotel filling up with the stars who had gathered to celebrate, and the last song she is said to have sung in public was the simple childhood hymn, "Jesus Loves Me." The coroner found heart disease and cocaine among the contributing factors in her accidental drowning, an explanation that seemed clear enough until the almost unbearable coincidence 3 years later, when her only daughter was discovered in nearly identical circumstances and soon passed away, transforming a private sorrow into something that felt, to a watching world, like a haunting the family could not escape. She rests here now, beside her father in New Jersey, home at last, the woman with the golden voice, her death a sorrow that questions still surround. Let us make our way now to Chanhassen, in Minnesota, to a place unlike any other on our journey, the private compound called Paisley Park, where a musical genius both lived and now, in a sense, remains. Prince was one of the most dazzlingly original artists in the history of popular music, a virtuoso who seemed to embody the very spirit of sound. In April of 2016, at just 57 years old, he was found unresponsive in an elevator at Paisley Park, his beloved home and studio, and could not be revived. The cause of death was determined to be an accidental overdose of fentanyl, an extraordinarily powerful painkiller. But here lay the mystery, for Prince was known to shun hard drugs, and it emerged that he had been taking counterfeit pills, made to look like an ordinary prescription medication, but secretly laced with the deadly fentanyl that killed him. The great unanswered question, the source of those poisoned pills, was investigated for years but never resolved, and in the end, no one was ever charged in connection with his death. He was cremated, and his ashes were placed inside a custom urn shaped like Paisley Park itself, kept within the very walls he loved. A peerless songwriter and singer, and one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, Prince had sold well over 100 million records across his career while guarding his privacy with famous ferocity. Just days before the end, his private plane had been forced to make an emergency landing so that he could be rushed to a hospital after a health scare, a frightening prelude to what was to come. The pills that killed him proved to be counterfeits, fakes pressed to resemble an ordinary prescription painkiller but secretly laced with fentanyl many times more powerful, and a long federal investigation into who had supplied them ended after 2 full years, with no charges filed against anyone at all. He was cremated, and his ashes were placed inside a custom urn shaped like Paisley Park itself. And so he rests there still, in the home he never wanted to leave. The mystery of how the fatal counterfeit pills reached his hands never solved. And now, friends, we come to the last grave of our journey, and it is the strangest of them all, for it is a grave that holds no one at all. Let us travel to Arlington National Cemetery, to a simple white marble stone that marks the memory of Major Alton Glenn Miller, the greatest bandleader of the swing era. Glenn Miller's music, from Moonlight Serenade to In the Mood, was the very sound of a generation, and at the peak of his fame he set aside his glittering career to serve his country in the Second World War, leading a military band to raise the spirits of the troops. On the 15th of December, 1944, on a cold and foggy afternoon, he boarded a small plane in England, bound for Paris, where he was to arrange a Christmas concert for the soldiers who had liberated the city. The plane took off into the mist over the English Channel and was never seen again. No wreckage was ever found, no body was ever recovered, and to this very day the great bandleader is officially listed as missing. The theories are many, of icing on the wings, of bombs jettisoned from planes overhead, even of secret missions and espionage, but the truth vanished with him into the gray water. Miller had given the world the very first certified gold record, and had put on some 800 shows for the troops, earning the Bronze Star for lifting the spirits of a war-weary generation. He was not even supposed to be aboard the small aircraft that fateful day, having hitched an unauthorized ride in his impatience to beat the worsening weather, and he is said to have remarked uneasily on the fact that the little plane carried no parachutes. The theories about what happened over the channel range from simple icing on the wings to the grim possibility that bombs jettisoned by returning Allied bombers fell by accident upon the tiny aircraft below. And in 1987, a fisherman even reported having once dragged up an aircraft wreck that he came to fear was Miller's, only to be told to leave it undisturbed as a war grave. Officially, he remains missing in action to this very day. Decades later, at his daughter's request, this memorial stone was placed here at Arlington, marking a grave that will forever remain empty. And so we end our long walk not before a tomb, but before a question carved in marble, the final and most complete mystery of all. So there it is, friends, our procession of the unexplained, drawing at last to its close. We have walked among the graves of the poisoned and the drowned, the shot and the beaten, the vanished and the merely doubted, and everywhere we have found the same open wound, a death that the world could never quite bring itself to close. We have stood before rulings of accident that no one believed, and verdicts of suicide that reeked of something worse, and murders whose perpetrators melted away into the dark. We have seen, again and again, how fame does not shield a person from a mysterious end, but sometimes seems to invite it. How the brightest lives can be snuffed out in the most bewildering of ways, and how the questions can outlive the answers by generations. And through it all, we have tried to hold two things together in the same gentle grip: a real respect for the dead, and an honest reckoning with the mysteries that surround them. For in the end, that is why we came. Not to solve these riddles, for many of them can never now be solved, but simply to remember the men and women at the heart of them, to speak their names aloud, and to acknowledge that they deserved better than an ending shrouded in fog. Consider, as we prepare to leave this place, one last thread that has quietly bound our whole long procession together. In case after case, the official story and the private grief simply refuse to agree. A coroner would sign a certificate, a file would be closed, a verdict would be entered neatly into the record, and yet the mothers and fathers, the children and the friends of the dead would go on shaking their heads, certain in their bones that something essential had been missed, or hidden, or hurried past in the dark. Sometimes, surely, they were wrong, comforted by the idea of a conspiracy that spared them the plainer and harder pain of an ordinary, senseless tragedy. But sometimes, we must honestly admit, they were surely right, and the tidy official account was a door closed far too soon upon a truth that someone, somewhere, preferred to keep buried. That is the peculiar torment of the mysterious death, that it denies the living the one thing they most desperately need, which is not vengeance, and not even justice, but simply an answer, a place at last to set down the terrible weight of not knowing. And so these graves are different from all the ordinary ones around them. An ordinary grave marks an ending, but every grave we have visited tonight marks instead a question that never ended, a door left forever ajar, a sentence trailing off unfinished into the silence. So let the detectives and the historians go on arguing. Tonight, we simply came to stand for a moment in the beautiful, unsettling silence where the answers ought to be, and to keep these restless souls company. Rest well, friends, every one of you, whatever secrets you have taken with you into the ground, or into the sea, or into the fog above the channel. And rest well to you as well, my fellow travelers on this shadowed road, until we walk together again.